Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us. I'm Shao Nandi. I'm CIO of Dow Jones, and I work for News Corp as our head of shared services as well. We're going to talk to you a bit about what we're doing with CloudFront and how we're protecting ourselves from DDoS attacks, traffic spikes, application layer threats. And we're going to cover this in a couple of ways. First, I'll tell you a little bit about Dow Jones. We're going to talk about our usage of Shield and why we picked Shield as a product to help protect us from DDoS. Doug and Lee are going to talk about CloudFront and what it meant for us to get there, what some of the pitfalls and challenges are, our migration to ALBs, and finally a little bit about what we've been doing with Lambda on the edge. So just so you know who's speaking, Doug Ryder, he's our head of consumer engineering. He runs all of our development and engineering shop basically for all of our consumer products. I'll tell you a bit about them. And Lee Cookson, who's one of our senior DevOps leaders, one of the folks out there actually getting this work done. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Dow Jones. So I'll quote our CEO. Our mission is to deliver valuable news information from the first flash to the last word. Great little bullet. What does that really mean? Well, we're a 135-year-old company. What we're probably best known for is the Wall Street Journal, relatively self-explanatory, well over 1 million digital subscribers, provide content and news in countries all around the world. We also have a very large B2B business. Factiva is one of our products. It ingests about 30,000 different news sources daily. It has well over 1.3 billion articles in it. We take that data and we sell it both directly via user interface as well as via API to the world's largest banks, consulting companies. Pretty much every company in the world consumes that data. We have a whole set of products in this space, products around risk and compliance reports, products around flash news, and then there's Dow Jones Media Group. Dow Jones Media Group is made up of a whole bunch of other really interesting publications, Barron's Magazine, MarketWatch.com, Mansion Global, and Doug's going to tell you a little bit about what some of these products do and how we operate them from a CloudFront perspective. The other context on Dow Jones that's probably more important to most of you is our usage of cloud. So as a 135-year-old enterprise, do you think we'd probably be relatively late to the public cloud party? Most of our peer sets were. Well, back in 2013, Dow Jones made a pretty huge bet and decided to move 75% of our compute footprint to Amazon. And that decision was not 75% of the digital footprint. It wasn't 75% of the new stuff. We wanted to move 75% of everything. And at the time, right now, that seems okay, people are doing that. But in 2013, people were not doing that. It was considered to be a relatively audacious thing. Some of the firms out there said must be a bit of a marketing stunt. Well, we're a news company. We don't make marketing stunts around tech. We wanted the agility, we wanted the scale, we wanted to get out of operating data centers. And we also wanted for our consumer publications the ability to be able to serve content everywhere quickly and change it quickly. And I can tell you about 4 years later on the journey, we've done pretty good. Probably about 65% of our compute power is in the cloud, almost all of our consumer content, a lot of our enterprise systems, a lot of those big iron B2B systems. We're heavy users of a lot of serverless technology. We're using containers, doing all kinds of cool stuff. But I think we really want to focus in the discussion on CloudFront, and I'll hand off to Doug to talk a little bit about.
I think it's going to be interesting. Wow, that's a little loud. I think it's going to be interesting because we were one of the early adopters of the cloud, one of the original properties that moved out. And you'll see some of the properties here that we moved out with. You'll recognize some of you won't. Some of them you won't recognize because you're not in Japan or you're not in London. But you, of course, recognize the Wall Street Journal. You recognize Barron's, probably. FN London's are one of our Londons, is in London. It's eFinancial News, what used to be eFinancial News. Private Equity News is another product for high-end. Most of these products have an interesting demographic in the fact that they're mostly subscription-based and advertising-based, so it's a little different. We also have some other properties that are entirely advertising-based. The other interesting thing about this is we're going to talk about as we go through it is, okay, we started off differently as a lot of different products on this group. And really, we're using a lot of the same architecture, a lot of the same deployment, a lot of the same model. I could take an architecture diagram from one of these and use it in any of the properties, and it really doesn't change much, which is nice in the fact that we make a change, we can leverage it everywhere pretty quickly. It also means that we can still innovate, right? We have a bunch of teams, input to this process, and it allows us to have one team experiment too before we roll it out to everything else. So. Okay. This is what our basic model looks like in one region. One thing you're going to, hopefully in this conversation, learn about us is we really don't treat a region like other people treat a region. We consider it more like like other people consider a data center or a DZ. There's many reasons for this, but a lot of them have to do with a little hurricane called Sandy. We had some problems in our initial footprint in our data center from our 2 locations. And after that we decided that anything we did would be entirely separate, meaning If we have a failure in one of these data centers, the other one doesn't know. So we treat a region like a data center. You'll notice that if you look at this diagram, you will see that we have AWS Shield in front. We have Amazon CloudFront. We are using their certificate management from AWS. We have ALBs, and we have EC2 instances, which also in the future can be Docker containers or Kubernetes or whatever. It doesn't really matter. The interesting thing about this is, when we move to the cloud, the only thing that's really left is the code on that EC2 instance. Everything else has really changed. We went out with Elastic Load Balancers, which is the original load balancers. We had our own certs. We didn't use CloudFront. We used somebody else. And we didn't have AWS Shield in front of us. So in the time since we've moved, we've changed all that, and pretty easily, actually. It hasn't been too painful. So that's something to keep in mind. Once you move to the cloud, don't be afraid to change things out. I have a couple general rules. I don't try anything on a big site first. You try them on a small site first. I'm not afraid of new ideas, and you shouldn't be either. And don't be afraid of the cloud. So advanced Shield. So I'll get back to Shao.
So before we go too deep into sort of how we architect this CloudFront, we have to talk about why. Why did we pick Shield? Why did we go to CloudFront? We've obviously running digital properties for a long, long time, and there are a lot of vendors out there that helped us do that. Well, first, we had a rise in DDoS attacks. And it was very much focused on whether it was HTTP floods or UDP floods. It was happening on a recurring basis, and both on-premise and even when we first went to Amazon, we were able to scale out to a large extent. One of the most interesting examples of an attack would be we kept seeing application-level SQL injection attacks that actually would result in an effective DDoS, because they'd go and overwhelm some piece of infrastructure behind the scenes and DDoS us even when the purpose of the SQL injection attack was not to shut us down. It was to find a way in, discover if IDs could be reused, look for passwords, et cetera, et cetera. The pain point with this was never how do we scale out of it. It was as we start to creep up, how reactive could we be, how could we shut it down, and how could we not run way in excess capacity to keep us from having to go and have a big standby infrastructure. So mitigation for us started on-premise, right? We used to run our sites on-premise, and even when we first went out, many of our sites would still route back to on-premise and be delivered from there. And on-premise, you could buy pretty large firewalls. In fact, our current firewall set does a great job of DDoS mitigation. But at the end of the day, they can only scale so far. It can never scale against a big enough attack, and you're stuck building really large pipes that go well beyond daily traffic for what reason. So cloud routed. This is what many companies are out there using. There are a bunch of providers who do this. Independent of where you're based, independent of who your provider is, there are a bunch of third parties who will provide you with cloud routed infrastructure. The problem, the first thing to solve for us was we got away from our large CapEx on-premise, which was great. We got away from having to sort of maintain that big stack. But we immediately realized we'd lost a bunch of visibility and control. When it was coming through our on-premise environment, we could see what was happening in relative real time. We had good management on the firewalls. We could go and make quick decisions. Now we're working with a third party, and what we found is the particular third party we were working with, they were an amazing black box. So when things went well, we were happy. We didn't need to understand anything. But when things went wrong, we'd be like, we need to make a change. Let's bring the professional services team in. We want to self-serve that change. Our customers don't usually want to self-serve changes. Well, we're not your typical customer. We want to be able to make changes. We would take less functionality if we control our own destiny. And that became a really painful problem to the point where even the engineering teams were frustrated. Of course, the operations teams were frustrated during SEVs. And I'd say the last bit would be we kept finding amazing incompatibilities in our partners in the cloud routed world where, okay, we bought their new DDoS mitigation product. Oh, it doesn't work well with their WAF. It obfuscates the IPs so that when you're attacked, you can't shut the IPs down in the DDoS mitigation product. You have to do it in the WAF side, which maybe requires this extensive change process. Things that maybe don't make a lot of sense to the self-serve Amazon world, that was a major pain point for us. So off to cloud native, right, and off to Shield. We jumped onto Shield because we realized that with the level of work we were doing in Amazon, it just made sense to go to a single partner and have a single throat to choke when we had challenges. There was no more pointing fingers at this is coming from here, this is coming from there. We wanted the self-service portion. And I'll say with the Shield team, we were an early beta customer. We had a small subset of engineering team that was working with them very early on for some of our smaller sites. And when we came here last year at reInvent and sat down and talked to them, their level of openness and willingness to engage with us just sort of blew us away. There was nothing hidden under the covers. We understood the warts, we understood the capabilities, and that really was important to us to understand what we were getting and what we weren't. And we did have a bit of a debate. Are we losing a couple bits of functionality here and there? And we realized it didn't matter to be able to control our own destiny. So that's sort of what led us down the path. Of course, it's performed well. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here talking. It's gone well for us. Pricing has been very competitive. What's interesting is for most companies, pricing is a big reason to go and look at using a native cloud provider. It wasn't for us. For us, it was functionality, it was features, it was simplicity. But the pricing has been a good story as well. I won't go into that here, but I'll hand it back to Doug and Lee and take us through the details.
Back to the diagram. As I said originally, we started off very differently. Same general architecture model, but we did start off differently. We started off with another CDN provider. We had some incidents. And one of the things that was nice, and I'm not trying to sell Amazon, one of the things that was nice is when we did have one of those incidents, we got Amazon on the phone, even though we were using one of the other CDN providers, who we won't mention by name. And they actually did get on the phone and try and help us. They were limited in what they could do because we had the other CDN in front of us, but they did try and help and identify stuff. We also had fun stuff going on. And originally, before we had CloudFront, the logs took a long time to get to us. That caused some problems with security and with the developers trying to find out what was going on. You get it pretty quickly on CloudFront, which is very nice. The support's good. You don't have to do, in my opinion, you don't have to do as much to deploy a change. You don't need as much expertise to deploy a change. When you want to spin up a new site, it's a little easier, in our opinion, or at least in my opinion. That said, it is less powerful than the other CDN we were using. So based on, and we still do use that CDN for some of our static content, but I won't go into a lot of detail on that. So one of the things that really moved us, as I said, was support, their willingness to help us out, and just their openness, as Sean said. So we use CloudFront to distribute our traffic, and we're going to get into some details on that. And as I mentioned before a little bit with Sandy, we had some issues. We ended up in a situation where we had 2 data centers. In one data center, we had some of our services up. This is a simplified model. And the other data center, we had our sites up, and the 2 couldn't talk. We had a highly redundant link that failed. Hence, moving to the model where we always have 2 of everything that's independent of everything. So some of the things that we've learned along the road that hopefully will be useful to you guys. We always use SSL to origin now for our newer stuff. We still have legacy stuff, which I'm sure a lot of you in the room have, that is still back without SSL. But that's security, and we do that even without stuff we're doing with credit cards just for security's sake. And it's a good practice. And it's a lot easier when you're using CloudFront and the certificate management from AWS. We do use different domains for static content, and you're asking, why do we still do that? Because we have a lot of IE11 customers. We're hoping to change that in the future. We use security groups. We try and keep the options limited. We have some wrappers and tools that we use to make it easier on people deploying new stacks. We do believe in autoscaling, alarming, and one thing about that is we've changed our model a little bit over the years. When we were in the data center and before we started to move to the cloud, everything went through operations, and operations would be notifying the developers first. In our world, it's a mix. If somebody calls in, our operations staff pings us. Otherwise, we get notified first. We have warning alarms going out before there's a problem. We try and monitor things and say, hey, this is getting a little hot. Do we need to add boxes? You know, does this region not look good? Should we manually fail it over? That stuff is starting, hopefully, before we have a real problem where something goes out. And that's a good policy, actually, to have. That doesn't mean you shouldn't get operations involved, but it does mean that it's good to get your developers involved, the people who actually wrote the site. We have a couple different strategies generally that we use for how we deal with what we call DR and live failover. As I've said, we have multiple regions, and we're always generally running in one region and have one region in backup. That's actually the least common of our models. Our most common model is actually the second one, which is live in multiple regions. For our more important sites, what we call our crown jewels, we actually do a lot of live, and we have a cached backup. So we may personalize or target our content from the server based on you coming in, but if things fail, we have a static copy. So if both our regions fail, for instance, or for our homepage, you would get a static generic copy of our content. You'd get a heavily cached ugly site for our articles, The idea is that no matter what, we don't want to serve you a 502 oops page, which if anybody ever saw the news a couple years ago, we actually served. We try and avoid that. So we've gotten a little more redundant. We've actually even increased the number of our section pages that have static backups over the last couple months. So, and our goal is, you can never be 100% up, but our goal is to limit the damage when you're down. And our end state goal, we hope, is to have a situation where most people don't notice that we've gone down. It just may not be as good an experience, but it's still a WSJ experience, a Barron's experience, an FN London experience, a China WSJ experience. We do use AWS certificate management. If you are using CloudFront and you are using AWS, you should use it. It's free, but we'll get into that in a little detail. And we do use CloudFront logs. So, certificate management. The first line says a lot. It's free, and I would highly suggest you use it. It also updates your CloudFront instance and your LLBs, so you don't have to worry about it. If anybody's ever had the experience of having their certificate expire on their site, try and put an end to that. You can put an end to it. I suggest you do. Even our security guys love it. I mean, it takes it out of their hands. They had to approve all these certs. They had to worry about how are they renewing? Is the person still here who owned it? You know, all those kind of things, and it takes it out of their hands. It's easy to request. The only thing that's a little weird is if you're using load balancers, you sort of have to request in both. You know, if you're trying to go directly to a load balancer and you have a backup, you have to request from both regions. You can also import a certificate, so you can still manage it there even if you didn't get it there, though I suggest you get it from them. And it's just made our lives a lot easier, as I said. From the developers, from what the SAs were, our DevOps people, our security people, it's made our lives so much easier. So if you get nothing else out of that, use your certificate management. I'm going to talk a little bit about CloudFront versus going directly to the load balancer. Don't do number two. That's another thing, if you take anything away, don't go directly to the load balancer, because at some point you're going to need CloudFront anyway for something you need to do. Basically, CloudFront gives you more capabilities. It allows you to split stacks and paths around to different load balancers. You can also front, S3. It gives you some role separation, and it's just another layer of protection. I know some people do that, and we've done it in the past, but it's getting back, and as you can tell from a lot of what you've seen, we're not into single points of failure. We hate them, and it just leaves a single point of failure when you do that. So, some of the nice features of CloudFront. It's stable. It's easy to use. We've been using it for a while. We started off using it, as Shaun said, on a lot of our smaller sites. We started off, at least in my group, we started off using it a little bit in Japan. Then we started to use it for our new eFinancial news site, FN London. Then we started to move it for WSJ. WSJ was more interesting. A little background on something we did wrong. Just hopefully people will learn from that, or something that was, if I had to do it over again, I'd do differently. We actually moved to SSL before we moved to CloudFront. That probably cost, I shouldn't say probably, that cost us time. We ended up doing a lot of professional services with another CDN provider. We went through a lot more pain. We should have moved to CloudFront first. And when we did Barron's, we did. So just hopefully that'll be useful to some people. There are some limitations on CloudFront. The number of routes and patterns you can use is limited to 50. You can ask for more. They'll probably shoot me for saying that. It does pool your SSL connections. So basic stuff. We heavily believe in DR. We're a news site. It's our reputation. If we can't get the content to the user, that's bad. We are not paranoid. We do get attacked, as Shaun will tell you. We may be crazy, but we're not paranoid. People are out to get us. We always have to have extra capacity around in case somebody hits us. Hence why we got into Shield, and hence why we're concerned about auto-scaling and using those things. But I do want to get a little into something we're doing with Route 53, and I'm going to pass it to Lee in a little bit to talk about in more detail. But basically, we leverage Route 53 to control where and what stack we're going to. So basically, we have generally 2 regions up. using multiple AZs. We direct traffic to both. On our more critical sites, we also have a available DR site. There's a static either S3 copy or another copy of the site that acts as DR that's heavily cached. In most situations, using this process, we actually automatically fail over to the DR site. There are those instances which are what I consider worse to some degree, is when we get a partial failure and the site and that domain doesn't entirely fail, and then we manually move it over. But using Route 53, we can do that in about a minute. And that's actually saved us a couple times from mistakes on deployments, or us causing a spike, or somebody else trying to attack us. And that's important, especially on the media site. And we do have a console option to do it. And I'm going to pass to Mike to Lee so he can go into more details.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so he's mentioned a lot of cool features that we have that mostly we implemented ourselves at a high level. The Route 53 feature, we call it site control. It's just, we gave it a brand name. It's basically a nicer UI on top of what Route 53 normally does for you. The Amazon console is pretty cool, but it doesn't really hide a lot of the complexity. Like if you go into Route 53, if anyone's used the console for Route 53, you can get lost pretty quick. Especially if you're doing failover and aliasing and all that. So we basically wrote a tool on top of that that lets you in a very nice methodical way define primary origins, 1, 2, or 3 of them, depending on how many regions that that page is supported by. And then also do failovers and weight them, so you can actually have 2 or 3 tiers of failover. We actually have a reduced capability site that fails over from the home page first, and it looks just like the real page. And then we actually have a 3rd tier, which is basically, you know, in case of emergency break glass, it'll go to another version. And they're really just buttons that you push. And like Doug said, in about a minute, the DNS resolver picks up the change. And coming through CloudFront, since CloudFront's making the DNS request to find the right origin, if the first 2 origins are sick, it'll go back to the, you know, the primary origins are sick, it'll go to the fallback. And then if we suspend that for whatever reason manually, or we could manually suspend one region, for example, it'll cascade down to the next level of failover. So that's really just Route 53 out of the box, but with kind of all the complexity of the console UI taken out of it. So yeah, that's really what it is. The 2 diagrams here basically show, for example, 2 regions, say, you know, west and east, and site control in concert with CloudFront will try to do geolocation and weighting and try to distribute the load to the proper region for each request. And it's really, again, that's really just a Route 53 feature, like I said, that we've wrapped with a nicer UI. And that's why what Doug said is most of the time we have an outage, sometimes people don't even know. For example, if a deployment goes bad in Oregon and the app crashes, nobody even knows about it because site control will do the keep alive to Oregon, it'll fail, and it'll stop sending traffic to Oregon. All the traffic will go to Virginia, Virginia will scale up, we'll get alerts, redeploy Oregon. Once Oregon's healthy, site control keep alive will detect that Oregon's healthy and send traffic back to it. And unfortunately, that happens a little more than we'd like, but it's routine. So you don't actually have any user impact, which is the end goal, of course. So ALBs. We have a deployment platform that orchestrates deployments. It creates the ELBs, security groups, ASGs, launch configuration, you name it. I won't go into details about that. But ELBs compared to ALBs are very simple. So with ALBs, they added a lot more components to make them, I guess, more future-proof. So we spent some time you know, rewriting our orchestration to produce ALBs for the stacks when they're spun up. The main benefit, actually, other than WebSockets, which actually there's a lot of use cases where you have a vendor. We actually have a vendor for commenting. They need WebSockets, and classic ELB didn't have that. So that was actually one of our drivers. But in addition, what clinched it for us was that all the new security features around Shield and Shield Advanced are never going to go into ELB Classic. So if you want to keep up with the times, you really have to go to ALBs. And they give us other features that we're not using, like the ability to route traffic to multiple backends of the load balancer. We're not using that at the moment. But primarily, again, for WebSockets and the new security features. Yeah, this is pretty much what I said. Yeah, WebSocket support. Basically, ALBs are going to have new features. ELBs are going to get no new features. So at this point, if you're starting off, don't even consider classic ELBs unless you need pure network balancing.
There's more features than that, but those are the ones that are key to us.
Yeah, and this is basically what I just told you. WebSockets, improved security management, since it's any Shield or DDoS feature of the ELB will only be in the new application load balancer, not in the classics. Yeah, there was actually an interesting pitfall, and we had 2 or 3 apps hit it. Bad URLs with the classic ELB, they would normalize out repeated forward slashes, and it would just work. And nobody realized that they were generating bad URLs in the front end. The ALBs enforce that. So that's just a little tip to look ahead. So if you have bad URLs, make sure they fix them. Otherwise, the ALB will flag them as a 400, which they are. The ELBs just kind of let it go through. You can actually attach multiple certificates to an ALB now. So instead of asking for, if you host multiple domains on the same endpoint, what we'd have to do is say, oh, let's create a new ACM cert with the number of domains +1, and then reattach it and replace the old one. Now you can kind of treat your groups of domains if you want and create individual certs. ACM will still refresh them all. But you don't have to keep doing domain +1, domain +1. You can basically group them appropriately and perhaps even reuse them on other apps that may also be behind the same domains. So that's kind of an interesting feature. Lambda on the edge. We went live with it in preview. Yeah, it wasn't quite up to what we were using it for, so we backed it out at first. But it's got some really cool features. We actually did A/B testing on Barron's. It's kind of a classic example that they give you when you pick up Lambda on the edge. It basically puts the routing decision closer to the user so that your application, for example, you may have 2 completely independent applications. This is actually our new Barron's homepage on the left and our old one on the right. The old one we considered legacy. Like, I won't even go into how legacy it was. We didn't want to touch it. We weren't going to touch one line of code on it. So A/B testing wasn't going to live there. The new app, we basically didn't want to pollute it with knowing about the old one. So we didn't want B to know about A, and we definitely didn't want A knowing about B. And that was a good application of using it. We dropped a cookie so that once they hit one of those, they stayed on it. Again, that's pretty much in the Lambda on the edge examples. Again, along the lines of Route 53, if you've messed with Lambda in the console, it's not the most pleasant experience. And that's a lesson learned. They actually changed part of the requirements in the middle of what we were doing. You used to be able to connect the latest version of a Lambda on the edge to your CloudFront rule. And then they changed it, so you had to tag it and only use a tag. So that was interesting. We picked that up really quick. There's docs, of course, and all that. But again, it was in preview. It was just out of preview, I think, and they changed that feature. But it was a completely appropriate place to do that, as opposed to, for example, spinning up a new stack that only did A/B testing, and then you have more and more layers within your application stack for a short period of time. Basically, we could put this in once we were comfortable with the users giving us feedback about the new homepage design. We just pulled it out, sent everybody the new homepage, and we were done. So the Lambda on the edge was literally like 20 lines of code, and then it was gone. There's a lot of other really good things that we have in mind for doing here. One of the restrictions was that you couldn't do TCP connections out from a Lambda on the edge. They just added that actually just a week ago, I think, for the incoming request, which means you could do, for example, an auth call out. You could chop up a cookie, validate it before you get to your app layer. That's actually something that, like I said, I just learned about it last week. That could be interesting. Because again, authentication is something you want consistent across. Like I said, we have dozens of apps behind the website, and they all have a common piece of code. But updating that code means you have to deploy it to different stacks. If you can put it here, that'd be a huge benefit. And that's just something that, like I said, that feature just came out. That's one other thing about AWS. They're always surprising you. You're always like, oh man, I can't do that. And then you go up to somebody and say, yeah, you can't do that, and Lambda on the edge. And somebody says, yeah, you can. Last week, I just got a mail. So we're using it in a relatively limited way right now. We're using it for some URL rewriting that the backend platform required. But yeah, I think we're going to do a lot more with it in the future.
We do plan to use it a lot more in the future, especially for A/B testing. So
yeah, yeah, I think this is pretty much what I went over. Yeah, this is just this is actually sort of an adapter to a legacy platform. We back in the day, we had load balancers on-prem, I don't know, like 15, 16, 17 years ago. Long time ago. We went through 2, Hourpoint, NetScaler. Anyway, so way back in the day, somebody said, hey, when we want to send the client IP from the actual endpoint to the apps, let's throw a header in called client-IP. Sounded great. I don't think there was a standard for Xforwardedfor or anything like that, right? Well, we still have some of those apps running somewhere. And because CloudFront is now the first point of contact, that's the only place where you know what the IP is. And again, you're not necessarily going to go in and hack up all your old code from 10, 15 years ago. So this is a good place to basically shim in the client IP header using what was already set by CloudFront for the Xforwardedfor header. And this is, again, this is just a few lines of code. But it solved a specific problem for a specific use case that we had for something that was legacy. Let's see. The A/B testing, handling more complex routing rules. We actually just learned a few more things that we can do to help us move more of our rules into CloudFront. Yesterday, old cookie cleanup. Yeah, you can do all kinds of weird things with cookies, of course, because that's the first point of contact. You can do redirects, things like that. That's it. Any questions?
yeah, we did want to leave a decent amount of time for questions because we figured that would be more productive. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a couple of questions. So in terms of ALB, like the WebSockets support,
Right.
what is the use case it enables you from a site perspective?
Use case, well, we have.
Why don't you just repeat the question in case?
Yeah, so the question is, what would be a good use case for WebSockets? Usually the WebSockets come to you. So for us, we have an old platform that does some live pulling of data, quotes, or news, and that could be a good use case for it, where the browser's sitting there and you want to pull live data. So you're updating quotes or updating
Yeah,
a newspaper.
and that was actually upgraded to support it, and so that's one
Right.
of the things we wanted to implement.
Yeah, that's future, but that means that's going to enable us to do that. The other one is we have a third-party vendor for commenting. And we liked everything about the vendor. We threw it in, and they said, oh, we only support a WebSocket interface from the browser. And we said, So that was actually our main drive to switch from ELBs to the classic ones to the ALBs.
Next question was
Okay.
around the Lambda on the edge.
Yes.
So is that, how does that, how is the charge for that? Is it by request?
Lambda on the edge charge is about, I think it's a cost per 100 milliseconds, I think. Lambda on the edge, fundamentally, you want everything you're doing there to be really fast, which is, I believe, why they originally said no outgoing TCP connections. So once you start giving a programmer TCP connections at the edge, you're asking for latency. So they've added that feature. You can still define a timeout. So if your Lambda doesn't respond within a certain amount of time, just go to the origin without any modifications. So in
well, it
CloudFront,
depends.
yeah, your routing rules are based on what they call behaviors, and there's patterns. It really depends on how often that pattern is invoked. So if you have / for your homepage, the Lambda attached to it would only get invoked when somebody goes to your homepage. And if you have a Lambda attached to /article, it'll only get invoked when somebody hits an article. So yeah,
That's up to you.
Yeah.
Basically, it comes down up to you. You choose what pass you want to apply your Lambda rules to. That's going to drive what your cost is.
Yeah.
Do you think it's better than just changing your header on your header page to redirect?
It's more flexible.
Well, I'm not understanding what you mean by changing your header.
So if you just wanted to, I thought this was for your A/B testing of your other site, right?
Yeah, that's one way to do it.
No, the
That's
A/B
one way.
testing was not changing the header. That was actually making an implementation where we keep a sticky reference to each page. So basically, if we had somebody come in, you came in the first time, you would get one of those pages. And what we were doing is using Lambda to also drop a cookie to tell us, okay, the next time you come in, also go to this one. So Lambda was doing the direction to each stack. There were two independent stacks. One's a Java stack, one was a Node stack. And based on who you were, we were directing you to that A/B test and also making sure it was consistent. That was one use case. The other use case that Lee was going into was to apply a header. That was the sample
I
code.
think what you're referring to is you meant the navigation in the header, like the link to the homepage?
Yeah, no, I just thought that,
Okay.
if you wanted to go to, your new site, right?
Well, this was just one page. This was the homepage.
Okay.
So we were only redesigning the homepage. And we wanted to stay sticky so people wouldn't get thrashed back and forth between the radically different designs.
Makes sense.
The code was not a sample of this.
Yeah, one early approach was to redirect you in the browser to another URL.
Yeah.
But that meant people could just start sharing the new homepage and the navigation. Everything would just involve more 302s and stuff like that. So that was more complicated, actually, than just routing it through the Lambda and switching. Though actually it did redirect you. It's just the cookie made sure that if you came back to the homepage, it would redirect you to the new one. So actually we did do that. But again, you can't just change the link in the nav bar because again, the nav bar on different pages, the bookmarks wouldn't be affected, things like that.
Makes sense.
So it had to be sticky with a cookie, and the Lambda could see the cookie, set the cookie, and redirect you if you were in the target group.
Okay, thank you.
I agree that ACM is really cool, but there's the piece about having to auth the request. So you've got a dev who puts in the certificate request, and then an email gets generated. How are you guys doing that? You just have a knock group or something?
We have a Charlie.
We have a queue called Charlie.
Yeah, no.
He
Well,
actually approves
optimally, since requesting a certificate for your domains is very, it has to be authenticated, right? We have a distro list that is hooked up to the whois record, I guess you could say. So they try to find out who to send the approval email, and then you have to click on it, go to a web page, click again, and it's for actually each domain. So that's another reason the domain plus one approach. Charlie has to keep, if we go from 6 domains to 7, 7 to 8, 8 to 9, and we keep adding more domains to the one cert, he has to get 8 emails and approve all 8 when we get to that point. Whereas if we group them and we go from 2 to 3, and the core domains are just a locked-in cert, then he only has to approve 3. It really comes down to your workflow. Yeah. But yeah, it's sent to a distro list. There's 3 or 4 people who get the mail. Everybody else ignores it and lets Charlie do it. But yeah, I mean, that's a typical approach.
I will say that even though it sounds really obvious, we found this historically. If you ever have it not go to a distro list, you're set yourself up for failure. Because someone is going to leave, take a long vacation, whatever. Doesn't really matter if they're a 24/7 person.
Get hit by a car.
Yeah.
Hopefully not.
Lottery.
We have ours go to a mailbox, and that's probably the wrong approach because people just kind of ignore it and assume someone else will handle it.
Yeah. This is more of a distro list, so it goes to everybody who we consider approval worthy for that. Yeah. We got somebody over here?
Yeah, I just want to ask a DDoS-related question. So, I've been on the receiving end of a few layer 7 attacks, right? So just to ask a DDoS question, because this is a lot of time on the actual CDN. Having been on the receiving end of a number of layer 7 DDoS attacks, can you maybe share with us what tools were there? What was the process? I mean, picking these guys out of your log stream, it's great that the logs are there faster, but that's still a delayed response, right? You want to be looking at traffic live, figuring out what they're doing, where they're coming from, and what rules you can put in place. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, what I'd say is, well, maybe fortunately and unfortunately, we haven't seen sort of scale out attacks since we've shifted to CloudFront. We've had elevated traffic in many cases, which could be attributed to potential DDoS, but we've always just seen it sort of scale out and go away. Where we have seen repeated attacks are things like the SQL injection attack that I mentioned, where we see escalating traffic, and then we've been so simplistic as to we've had a couple different hybrid approaches. In one case, we've been taking a lot of that data and dumping it out to Splunk ES and looking for sort of trends there. And we have a SecOps team that's looking at that on a periodic basis. In fact, we recently, for one of our other properties, not consumer, saw a spike in traffic that was unexpected, it didn't meet trends, and we went back and were able to react to it and figure out what was happening. What we've done, and I'll say at the most simplistic of a lot of it, is going back and banning targeted IPs. I think what we've seen with CloudFront is there seems to be pretty good results with the Shield team around just putting in place enough scale that nothing sort of overwhelmed us yet.
And they're very responsive. And the other thing that's nice is our data security team can get to the logs a lot faster than our other provider.
So it's been a bit of a cultural change where a year ago, we couldn't depend on logging from the provider, maybe 6 months ago, because it was generally about a 24-hour wait time. In some cases, maybe 16 to 18. So what we had to do was put a lot of code somewhere within the applications to start capturing data, or even once during a DDoS attack, we actually started redeploying an application with shim code to actually go and capture and block.
We started off in that situation actually using the application logs. Believe me, that's not the right way to do it.
Right.
And in addition, there's a premium product called Shield Advance, and you pay an extra amount, and what you get is, I think you get more of the AI kind of adaptable model, but you also get a dedicated like hotline, if you will.
So while we blunt and Shield Advance, we adopted early on because at our scale, the cost was for us relatively trivial. Yeah. It has been a little opaque to know when they've done something nice for us and when we have not been attacked. Our best evidence has been we haven't taken an outage from this since we switched over. Now, how much of that is due to decreasing attacks? Well, we definitely see a lot of chatter and traffic where we're being pushed on, and we just don't know if no one's bothered to take the scale to try and overwhelm it, not to encourage that, but that's part of the open question. I'd say having better usage of the logs, though, is one of our roadmap items. How do we go and sort of integrate that into our alarms and mechanisms better? We've done it for targeted IP ranges. We had a peer publication who was attacked by a set of IP ranges who shared that information. We started looking for them, and we saw traffic coming from that 3 weeks later. We proactively cut them off at the WAF level.
I guess if there's a handful of IPs, you can blacklist that.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
But I think the cool thing about an ECD is you go behind an DSA type product, you get rid of all the mechanical traffic, and then you're just left to deal with the hard.
Exactly. Well, for the mechanical, the way that's the point of the mechanical crop, I guess. And what your original question was, what kind of reporting and information you're saying? We haven't been mining it. We just haven't seen the pressure and the outages, and it's on our do list to better understand, right? What have they mitigated, and where have we just been lucky?
They weren't getting mitigated before, so we were seeing a lot of it, and we were doing a lot of mining on it. Now it's more like we're not really seeing them as much. We do see some stuff come through, but knock on wood, nothing to the extent that it was in the past.
Honestly, most of the time it's because the editors just put something really cool in the home.
Well, that's okay.
And then we freak out. We're like, oh my God, why is this going up?
No, we don't really freak out anymore. We just say, hey, there's a big jump of traffic. It's like, well, so okay.
Yeah.
Was there a big news story?
Yeah.
Other questions?
Somebody over here.
Thank you. Wanted to ask a question about site control tool. Is this something that you're going to contribute to open source or commercialize eventually?
We could. I don't want to get into the long story behind the platform it's on right now.
It's tied to another tool is what it comes down to.
Yeah, but it's essentially, it is really just UI. The other tool is really an orchestration engine for deploying, and site control works with it well, because if you're going to put your app in 2 regions, Route 53/site control for us is what lets you do a turnkey approach. You basically throw in your Virginia region, you throw in your Ohio region, your Oregon region, make sure the keep alives work, and then you can put it behind your CloudFront behavior as an origin.
It's actually
so we integrated it as a UI, but really it's like a zero data kind of UI, right? It really is just a conduit to orchestrate how to set up the aliases and the right rules and all the little buttons and knobs in Route 53. We could consider it.
Well, what I'd say is that we wouldn't commercialize it. We'd contribute it if there was interest that would take uptake, right? We all struggle with, is this tool something people want to learn about and build their own version of, or do they really want our code and try to play with it? I think we'd be open.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing harmful about it. It just happens. The reason we haven't is because it's tied into another tool, and it's just taking it out of the tool is a little bit of a pain. It's something we want to actually do in the long term is take it out of that tool, and then it becomes easy to.
And Dow Jones has contributed from our news graphics team to our DevOps team, and in different areas we've contributed different tools, either to like the NPM community or other places like that. So this would be a good candidate. But like you said, right now the reason it's not easy to just drop out there as open source is that it is at the moment tied in with another product that is kind of does something different.
The reason I'm asking is we've gone through a similar exercise of setting up like a failover regions and for disaster recovery, and that would be, and probably felt similar pains with Route 53. So it'd be cool to see what you guys done.
Yeah, I think it'd be worth an offline conversation because we might be able to share it with you.
Yeah, I mean,
as a friendly discussion.
I mean, basically, all we did is throw two-factor authentication. We'd have to restrict it.
Oh, it wasn't in there when that went open source. Right-hand control wasn't in it at that point, was it?
Yeah,
I don't know.
It was very alpha at that point.
But no, good feedback. If that's interesting, we'll probably make that happen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm curious about your tool set for deployments and your release process. You guys have a lot of redundancy, so just this example here.
We created.
Repeat the question just for the.
Go ahead, you want to repeat, or I can do it. Basically, he was asking about our deployment methodology and the way we deploy things. We actually, currently in our area, we have a tool we created to deploy our applications. Most of our applications fall into two categories. Most of them, 95% of them are node applications these days. So we have a common build standard for it, and it actually deploys it to an EC2 instance. We can create a stack with an ALB. It has permissions layers in it with two-factor authentication. We could spend 2 hours talking about it.
That would be a different conference.
But that would be a different conference, and we haven't open sourced it at this point. We've talked about it, but we haven't done it. It's something we felt constrained by the present. When we started this, we felt very constrained by the options that we could deploy under. For them.
And the fundamental philosophy was when we go to an agile model and the teams control their own destiny, the more you have to ask other people for stuff and ask for infrastructure, the slower you're going to be. So the platform is called Servo. We're actually in the second iteration of it. We basically did it following our old cloud model and then totally redid it to be more of a standalone product. And it basically has security that you can control ingress, egress. It does the blue-green deployment. That's kind of its bread and butter. But it also has logging, which could use a little better. It could use a little more enhancement, but it supports a basic logging if you're looking for troubleshooting. It does basically everything you need. And if you throw site control in front of it, that gives you multi-region support out of the box, if you will. So you go to one place. As long as you have a keep alive that works, the ALB would be happy, site control will be happy. So there's a very minimum requirement for deploying an app in that environment. We do support Docker as well. We started to go down the process in the first iteration of doing PHP. I think we had a Ruby spin-off, and then we did Node, of course, was the mainstream. And then we said, all right, screw it. Docker was mature a few years ago. Docker is the other option. We actually have quite a few apps running in Docker as well. But again, it supports microservices really well. Any kind of small focused tool that you want to create, you can basically have it deployed in like half an hour and operationally ready. In that you can say, I want scale from 2 to 5 instances. I can put it in site control. I can put ingress and egress rules on it, all in the same place. You can have a dev and a QA and a prod stack, and you tweak your environments. It also, if anyone's familiar with it, when Server was built, it tried to strictly follow the 12-factor app model. And a lot of the decisions of no configuration in your code, reusable package, the same code that you did in dev and QA goes to prod. All the principles, if you look it up, 12-factor app is it's like probably a 10-minute read. So it's not one of those like too long, didn't read kind of things, you know.
It wasn't a 10-minute.
But the platform tries to follow that as well as possible because they are really good practices for the cloud. And again, it was cloud first. Everything we do now is cloud first.
Yeah,
And not only that, but we do multi-region first.
Yeah, and we do always do multi-region. We don't do anything that's not multi-region. We don't do anything anymore that's not cloud. We have legacy stuff that's not cloud that we're getting rid of. But our groups are all cloud-centric. Most of it in my teams use Servo, and some of the other teams. Not all the teams do. But even if they don't use that, they've come up with a deployment model that's similar in nature. They're trying to abstract a lot of the necessary knowledge from the developers to deploy an app, and also trying to put some security in place that not everyone can deploy, right? We don't want everybody in the company to be able to redeploy a production app, right?
Yeah, it has a ownership and a delegation, who's an owner, who's a user, and who isn't. So again, it has like that kind of basic.
Right. We have the concept of developers own the code. I mean, they're the owners of the application, and that also allows us to have different authentication models too. There's different situations where you might not want the developer to deploy, and that's fine. In our situation, we do, but it allows you to do both. But that was because of the tooling that was available at the time at AWS, and I haven't seen anything yet that is probably going to.
Yeah, there are some products. I just got a mail a couple months ago about CodeStar, which is basically write some code. It'll actually generate stubs, and it'll deploy it for you. Hit a button, answer a bunch of questions. It sounds cool. It sounds a little bit shiny, if you will, and you can do certain things really well. I'm not sure how much you can get under the covers of it, but there are other apps that are kind of in the space for what we did. But I haven't seen anything that would replace it, where I'd say, hey guys, let's get rid of Servo and do this other thing yet. But yeah, it was really driven at a team, like he said, operations. Like the only thing we use operations for are network and hard authentication, meaning who can actually get in and touch the resources.
The big delineation
below the app layer.
The big delineation has been the consumer web properties that tend to be lightweight node-based apps. Goes through this lightweight deployment model. And then for our heavier back-end apps, right, we have a more classic CI/CD pipeline to go and deploy that. And there's a lot of delineation. So you see, and while those teams are also cloud first, they have a lot more legacy they have to think about and connect back to. So they tend to have a lot more complexity in their deployment.
And there's different build cycles. Like we build and deploy all the time. They have enterprise customers. They can't do that. So you have different rules, business rules about when you can deploy things. Ours are sort of reversed. We actually deploy during the day generally, because it really doesn't matter if we deploy at night or not. We still got a bunch of customers.
We got more eyes on it.
We got more eyes on it. We have multiple regions we can fail between. We can back out very quickly. So it's actually more beneficial for us to deploy during the day than it is at night. But that's not the case on all of our properties.
Yeah. Well, so Docker is a pretty portable kind of framework. So it actually fits within our Servo. So you have two flavors. Either you have Node, in which case the Node package gets packaged up, sent off to S3, and when you get a scale-up event, or you're doing a blue-green deployment, basically the same thing in this case, it pulls down and just drops it on the machine and runs. Just with an AMI. With Docker, the Docker daemon is there. It'll download the Docker image that was also tarred up and packaged, and it'll run on the same EC2. And so everything about Docker or a Node app in our framework, it's really the same. It's just you either have a container or you have a Node app. But everything outside of that, from security and configuration, is the same.
But that's us. There's other people doing other things to deploy Docker.
Yeah,
right.
But
So
on the consumer apps that we've talked about primarily, that's the model. Docker versus not Docker to us is equivalent, and we run them on EC2s at the moment. But again, we're always looking to improve. We could have a model where you could deploy to ECS or something of that sort. We just haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah, so the B2B teams who aren't here use ECS more heavily.
Right.
They're using a fundamentally different model for orchestration, whereas you guys are using your classic orchestration model.
And it really, some of the reason behind that is because there hasn't been a cost benefit for us at the moment. If that changes, we would switch.
So you're running a VM on
Yes, right now the Docker is just a variant of what platform you're going to deploy through the Servo app that you create, or the Servo stack. And if you have a Docker file, it knows it's Docker and it deploys it as Docker to the EC2. If you don't, it treats it as a Node app and starts it up as a Node app. But otherwise, everything outside of that is equivalent as far as the UI and the configuration and all that. So. Well, Microservices is really, I mean, it's one of those buzzwords that either you use it right or you just use it as a buzzword. Microservice is just basically being agile and reducing your impact radius so that if you have a tool that does one thing really well, which is kind of the node methodology to begin with, like if you're going to create a node package or app, make it do one thing and one thing really well. So a microservice, to me, is really just something that does that one thing and does it really well. It encapsulates one data store and does everything about that data store, as opposed to something that tries to solve the whole world's problems. I wouldn't call our page generators a microservice because they have to understand all the different article types, all the different page layouts. That's not a microservice. We use React. It's a big thing. Microservices
really
more for tools
and
for smaller, like a Slack bot, I would call that a microservice. Because the whole thing could be 200 lines of code. And it's all about it's more about connecting the different components, Slack and the service and whatever it's trying to do in the back end, look up conference rooms, look up whatever, things like that. So to me, a microservice is just creating a small tool without all the extra overhead that does that one thing really well. So it's just another way to use the platform. There's nothing special about it, really, except what you do with it.
And that's our custom implementation. As I said, other people use other things to deploy Docker images if that's what you're interested in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he was asking about editors are changing content and they want to see it. Yeah, we basically, with the Servo model, we'll have a live stack, we'll have a staging stack, and we'll have what we call a pre-live stack or a preview stack. Yeah. It's hooked up to some of the same data sources as the live stack, but if an editor wants to see what a page looks like before the public, it'll switch over and pull the what's called pre-pub data.
Basically,
and render using the same exact app, the same exact page layout, but with that content in it before they
I think he was asking, is there a WYSIWYG tool out there to actually format the article?
No, that's really what they do. Yeah, we won't get into the editing platform because that's
a different discussion. But basically, we're more of in a model right now. We have a mix where we have a templating approach. We have a third-party tool that does the editing. They could choose a number of different templates. They also have a lot of freedom to put custom graphics into and have custom experiences too.
Right.
We want to improve upon that.
Right.
Yeah, so CMS is a pretty major transformation area. Right now, the net answer would be no, there's not really a WYSIWYG.
No, it's not a limitation of the front end as much as our present CMS.
But the way they solve that, and we've done this a long time, even on-prem, is they basically publish the content to a sandbox pre-pub area, and they run essentially the same code, but against the sandbox, so they can see what it looks like before they make it public, whether it's an article or the front page or the markets page or whatever.
One thing to remember in our business is even though there is a lot of great content that's just digital, the bulk of the content is targeting both digital and print.
Yeah,
so it's being built considering both platforms, and then you look at how it presents on the digital side and how it presents in the digital
side. Yeah, even two different users may not get the same article view in our world.
That's true.
Because we have different levels. So.
We didn't even get into firewall. Yeah, that's another thing. Oh, not firewall, paywall.
So
another issue.
Are you using a CMS product or is it
we have a pretty major CMS reasoning. So we can talk about that offline if you'd like to pop up afterward. We can tell you about it.
Yeah, it doesn't involve CloudFront at all, really.
Great. Well, I think we're timing out, but we'll be around for a few minutes if there's more questions.
Unless they kick us out of the room.
They'll probably give us a few minutes. Thank you all for coming.
Hope it was useful.